Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel to one of the most fascinating and most mysterious stories in the whole long history of the medieval world, to a time when the boundaries between faith and violence, between devotion and power, between poverty and wealth, were not just blurred, but deliberately fused together in the service of an idea so paradoxical that it has never stopped capturing the imagination of the people who encounter it. We are going to the age of the Crusades, to the dusty roads of the Holy Land, to the great fortress monasteries of Europe and the Near East, to the counting houses and the preceptories and the chambers where men who had taken vows of poverty administered wealth on a scale that no private institution in the medieval world could match. We are going to the story of the Knights Templar. The Templars were warrior monks, a combination that the medieval mind found simultaneously inspiring and unsettling. Men who had given up the ordinary world to serve God and who had been given permission by the highest authority in Christendom to kill in God's name without spiritual penalty. They wore white mantles with red crosses, and they rode into battle singing psalms, and they were, for nearly 2 centuries, the most effective military force in the medieval world. The shock troops of the crusading movement, the men who stood between the Christian kingdoms of the Holy Land and the armies that surrounded them on every side. And then, in the space of a few years at the beginning of the 14th century, they were destroyed, arrested in a single coordinated dawn raid across the whole of France, accused of crimes so bizarre and so sensational that even the people who ordered the accusations may not have entirely believed them, tortured into confessions that most of them later retracted and eventually disbanded by the Pope, who was supposed to protect them. The Templar story has everything. It has faith and violence, and extraordinary courage and astonishing hypocrisy. It has treasure and poverty, and the strange contradictions of an institution that was simultaneously a religious order and a military force and a financial empire and a political power. And it has a mystery, the mystery of what really happened at those late-night interrogation sessions and whether the accusations were true, and what became of the famous Templar treasure that the arresting officers never found, a mystery that has fed an entire industry of speculation and storytelling that continues to this day. But it is also, underneath all the drama, a very human story, a story about men who believed in something, who gave up everything for that belief, who built an institution that was remarkable in many ways and deeply flawed in others, and who were eventually destroyed not by the enemies they had spent their lives fighting, but by the political calculations of a French king who needed their money and a pope who could not afford to resist him. It is a story for the night, complex and shadowy, full of secrets and mysteries, and the particular quality of a truth that has been partially hidden and partially revealed and never quite fully recovered. Let it come to you slowly in the dark. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the ancient stones of Jerusalem come to you out of the darkness, warm with the heat of a day-long past. Let us begin. To understand the Knights Templar, you have to understand the world that produced them, and that world was a world in crisis, a world in which the comfortable certainties of the early medieval period had been shattered by events in the East that no one in Western Europe had quite seen coming, and no one, once they had come, quite knew how to respond to. The crisis was the loss of Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the year 1000 was a city that Christians could visit. It had been under Muslim rule since the 7th century, under the Umayyad Caliphate and then the Abbasid, and the relationship between the Muslim rulers and the Christian pilgrims, who came in large numbers to visit the holy sites, was complex but generally functional. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site of the crucifixion and resurrection, was accessible to Christian visitors, and while pilgrimage was dangerous, involving long sea voyages or overland journeys through territories that were never entirely safe, it was not impossible. Thousands of Europeans made the journey every year, and the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world meant that communication and commerce continued, despite the religious division. What changed the situation was the arrival of a new power in the region, the Seljuk Turks, a Turkic people from Central Asia who had converted to Sunni Islam and who expanded westward in the 11th century with extraordinary speed and force, defeating the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and taking control of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine state. The Seljuks were not uniformly hostile to Christian pilgrims, but their expansion disrupted the old arrangements, made pilgrimage more dangerous, and sent shockwaves through the Byzantine world that eventually reached the attention of the Pope in Rome. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood up at the Council of Clermont in France and gave a speech that changed the history of the world. He called on the knights and lords of Western Europe to take up arms and march east, to free Jerusalem and the holy places from Muslim rule, and to come to the aid of the Byzantine Christians who were under pressure from the Seljuks. The response was overwhelming and astonishing to everyone, including Urban himself, who had expected a measured and organized military expedition and got something much larger and much more chaotic, a mass movement of people from every level of society, noble and common, armed and unarmed, motivated by genuine religious devotion and by greed and by the particular restlessness of a society that was running out of land to distribute to its younger sons. The First Crusade, which set out in 1096 and arrived in the Levant the following year, was a military success of a kind that even its participants found difficult to explain, except in terms of divine intervention. The Crusaders, badly organized and perpetually short of supplies, managed to march through Anatolia, defeat several significant Seljuk armies, and capture Antioch after a long and brutal siege. And then, in July of 1099, they reached Jerusalem, besieged it, and took it in an assault that the chroniclers describe with a combination of triumphant religiosity and horrifying violence, because what the Crusaders did to the population of Jerusalem when the walls fell was a massacre of the kind that even contemporary observers found difficult to justify. The Crusaders who stayed in the Holy Land, the ones who did not go home once Jerusalem was taken, found themselves in a situation of extraordinary difficulty. They had captured a strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast, but they were surrounded by hostile powers on all sides, desperately short of manpower and dependent on the uncertain flow of reinforcements and supplies from a Europe that was thousands of miles away. The roads from the coast to Jerusalem, the routes that Christian pilgrims had to travel to, visit the holy sites, pass through dangerous countryside where bands of Muslim raiders could attack at will. Pilgrims were being killed and robbed on the roads between the coast and Jerusalem, and there was no one to protect them. It was this situation, the practical problem of protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land, that gave rise to the institution that would become the most famous military order in history. But the story of how 9 knights in a ruined building on the Temple Mount of Jerusalem became an organization of European-wide scope and power, with preceptories in every country and bankers in every major city, and an army that fought on the frontiers of Christendom, is a story that takes several decades to fully unfold, and it begins not with a dramatic founding moment, but with a quiet and unpromising beginning in a place that, when the knights first arrived there, had seen better days. The man whose name is attached to the founding of the Knights Templar was a French knight from Champagne named Jacques de Molay, and we know relatively little about him with certainty, which is appropriate for the beginning of an organization that would eventually become famous for its secrecy. What we know is that sometime around 1119, he and a small group of companions, the sources vary on the exact number, but 9 is the traditional count, approached Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, and proposed to form a military brotherhood dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. Baldwin received them with enthusiasm because the king of Jerusalem was always short of military manpower, and the offer of a group of experienced knights willing to dedicate their lives to the defense of the kingdom was not something he could afford to refuse. He gave them quarters in a wing of his palace on the Temple Mount, in the building that the Crusaders believed was the ancient Temple of Solomon, and that was in fact the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was from this location that the new brotherhood took its name, the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. They were the Templars, the men of the temple. The early years of the Templars were genuinely poor in the material sense. The 9 knights lived in the temple, maintained their horses, and patrolled the roads, but they had little money and little in the way of equipment beyond what they had brought with them. The famous image on the Templar seal, 2 knights sharing a single horse, is usually interpreted as a symbol of poverty, of 2 men so poor that they could not each afford their own mount, though some scholars have suggested it may represent something more complex. Whatever its original meaning, it became one of the most recognizable symbols of the medieval world. The organization that Jacques de Molay had founded might easily have remained a small and obscure group of knights doing a useful but unglamorous job in a corner of the Crusader kingdom if it had not attracted the attention of one of the most powerful and influential figures in the 12th century church. Bernard of Clairvaux was the most famous churchman of his age, a Cistercian monk of extraordinary energy and charisma, whose letters and sermons shaped the religious life of Europe and whose personal influence with popes and kings gave him a political power that went far beyond his formal authority. He was also Jacques de Molay's cousin, which may or may not have been a factor in his willingness to take up the cause of the new military order. In 1128, Jacques de Molay traveled to Europe to seek official recognition for his order and to recruit new members. He met with Bernard, and Bernard became the most effective advocate the Templars could have wished for. In a treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood, Bernard articulated a theology of the warrior monk that was both brilliant and, from a certain perspective, deeply troubling, because what Bernard was arguing was that killing in defense of the holy places was not just permissible for a Christian knight, but spiritually beneficial, that the Templar who killed a Muslim was not committing a sin, but performing a service to God, that dying in battle for Christ was as holy as dying in a monastery for Christ. This theological sleight of hand, this transformation of violence into devotion, was not universally accepted. There were voices in the church that found the concept of the warrior monk contradictory and dangerous, that argued that those who lived by the sword were diminished spiritually, regardless of the cause for which they wielded it. But Bernard's prestige was enormous, and his support for the Templars was decisive. At the Council of Troyes in 1128, the order received its official rule, the set of regulations governing the life of its members, and was granted formal papal recognition. With papal recognition came something that transformed the order almost overnight, from a small brotherhood of knights into one of the most powerful institutions in the medieval world. The Templars were granted exemption from episcopal authority, meaning that they were answerable directly to the Pope and not to the local bishops and archbishops in whose territories they operated. They were allowed to build their own churches and to have their own chaplains. They were exempt from the tithes that other landholders paid to the church. These privileges were extraordinary, and they attracted donations of land and money from across Europe with a speed that astonished everyone, because people who gave to the Templars were giving to what Bernard had told them was the holiest cause in Christendom, the defense of Jerusalem and the protection of the way to God's own city. The knights who came to join the order in the decades after Troyes were men of every background, from younger sons of great noble families who brought with them estates and connections as well as swords, to experienced soldiers who brought their skills and their willingness to die in a cause that seemed worthy of the sacrifice. The order developed a hierarchy and a structure. At the top was the Grand Master, the supreme leader of the order, elected by a council of senior brothers and answerable in principle only to the Pope. Below him was a complex structure of officers and officials, marshals and commanders and preceptors that managed the order's military and administrative affairs across a territory that eventually stretched from England to the Holy Land. And below, the knights were the sergeants, non-noble members, who served as soldiers and craftsmen and administrators, and the chaplains, the priests who served the order's spiritual needs, and the lay associates who were affiliated with the order without being full members. The life of a Templar knight was governed by the rule in extraordinary detail. He woke at a specific hour, prayed at specific times, ate meals that were regulated in their content and their manner of consumption, wore clothes of a specific style and color, was forbidden to hunt or to hawk or to play chess or to engage in any of the entertainments that the secular knights of the time considered part of their identity. He could not have a woman wash his head or his feet, could not have a woman look after his laundry, could not speak to a woman in private, could not show affection even to his own mother or sister. He was, in the most rigorous sense of the word, a monk, except that he was also a soldier, and the paradox of those two identities, which Bernard had resolved so elegantly in theory, had to be lived out in the daily practice of men who spent half their time in prayer and half their time in training to kill. The rule of the Templars, as it was elaborated over the decades following the Council of Troyes, was a document of remarkable complexity and specificity, reaching into every corner of the Templars' daily existence with a precision that left very little to individual discretion. This was deliberate because the men who wrote and refined the rule understood that an organization that combined military power with religious authority and vast financial resources was an organization that would be tempted by many things, and that the only defense against those temptations was a structure so detailed and so demanding that it left no room for personal interpretation. The daily schedule of a Templar was organized around the 7 canonical hours, the fixed times of prayer that structured monastic life throughout the medieval world. Matins and lauds in the middle of the night, prime at dawn, terce in mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers in the early evening, and compline before sleep. These prayer hours punctuated the day like a heartbeat, giving it rhythm and meaning, reminding the knight constantly that everything he did, including his training and his fighting, was in service of a spiritual purpose rather than a worldly one. The prayers were said in common where possible, the brothers gathering in the chapel for each hour, though a knight on campaign or on patrol had to manage his spiritual obligations as best he could in the circumstances. The meals were taken in the refectory in silence, while a brother read aloud from a religious text, and the food was simple and regulated, the kind of diet that sustained a fighting man without indulging him. Meat was served 3 times a week on the days when it was permitted, and fish and vegetables on the other days, and the brothers ate from shared bowls in pairs, a practice that encouraged a kind of enforced intimacy and mutual attention that was itself a form of spiritual discipline. Fasting was required on certain days of the week and on the vigils before major feast days, and the rule was careful to balance the need to keep the knights physically capable of fighting with the requirement that they experience the spiritual benefit of voluntary deprivation. The equipment of a Templar was standardized and regulated because uniformity was both a practical military advantage and a spiritual statement about the equality of the brothers before God and before the enemy. Each knight was entitled to 3 horses, a war horse, a palfrey for ordinary riding, and a pack horse for carrying equipment. He was provided with armor, a sword, a lance, a shield, and the other equipment of the medieval knight. His clothing was prescribed: the white mantle for knights, a black or brown mantle for sergeants, both marked with the red cross that identified the wearer as a servant of Christ and a soldier of the order. He was not allowed to add to or ornament his equipment beyond what was provided, not allowed to have his horse trappings decorated with silver, not allowed to wear rings or jewels, not allowed in any way to make himself more individual or more conspicuous than his brothers. The discipline of the Templar chapter, the regular meeting at which the brothers gathered to conduct the business of the order and to judge infractions of the rule, was another instrument of the total life that membership in the order required. The chapter met regularly, and at each meeting, brothers could be called to account for their behavior, accused by their fellows of violations of the rule, and subjected to penalties that ranged from loss of the mantle, the most serious non-expulsion penalty, to lighter punishments like fasting or eating on the floor like a dog. The proceedings of the chapter were secret, conducted behind closed doors with only full members present, And this secrecy, which had a perfectly functional purpose in an organization that needed to manage its internal discipline without providing its enemies with ammunition, would later be used against the order as evidence of sinister hidden practices. The training of a Templar Knight was continuous and demanding because the difference between a skilled and an unskilled fighter in medieval combat could easily be the difference between life and death, and the order could not afford to send poorly prepared men into battle against the experienced warriors of the Muslim states. Training involved horsemanship, since the cavalry charge was the central tactical element of medieval warfare and required horse and rider to work together with a degree of coordination that only long practice could achieve. It involved weapons training. Both the lance that was the primary weapon of the mounted charge and the sword that was used in the close quarters fighting that followed when the charge had spent itself. It involved the care and maintenance of equipment, because a knight whose armor failed him in battle was a knight who died, and the Templars were meticulous about the condition of their gear. And it involved formation training, the ability to work as part of a coordinated unit rather than as individual warriors. Because the Templar cavalry charge was not a romantic gesture but a military tactic that depended on mass and timing and discipline, the relationship between the Templar brothers was governed by the same combination of warmth and distance that the rule imposed on every other aspect of their lives. They were brothers in a genuine sense, bound to each other by the oaths they had taken and by the shared experience of a life that set them apart from everyone outside the order. They ate together and prayed together and trained together and fought together and died together, and the bonds formed by those shared experiences were real and lasting. But the rule imposed barriers between them as well, barriers against the particular intimacy that Bernard and the authors of the rule feared could become spiritually dangerous, against the exclusive friendships and the intense personal attachments that could distract a man from his first and only obligation, which was to God and to the order. The military reputation of the Knights Templar was earned over the course of nearly 2 centuries of fighting in the Holy Land and on the frontiers of Christendom, and it was a reputation built not primarily on spectacular single victories, though there were some of those, but on the consistent, reliable, professional military service that the order provided year after year in conditions that would have broken a less disciplined force. The Templars were not always victorious. No force fighting in the circumstances they faced could have been, but they were always there, always willing to fight, always the last to leave the field and the first to advance on the enemy. And this consistency was what made them indispensable. The tactics of the Templar cavalry were based on the massed charge, the simultaneous movement of a body of knights toward the enemy line at a speed and with a weight that was almost impossible to stop if the charge was properly executed. The charge was a terrifying thing to face. Hundreds of armored men on armored horses moving at the gallop, the ground shaking under the weight of them, the sound of them audible from a great distance. And the Templars were among the best in the world at delivering it. They were also among the best at the discipline required to hold back from the charge until the moment was right, because a premature charge that broke on a prepared defense was worse than no charge at all, and the rule specifically forbade a Templar from charging without the permission of his commander on pain of loss of the mantle. The fortresses that the Templars built and maintained in the Holy Land were another expression of their military role, engineering achievements of considerable sophistication that served as bases of operations, refuges for the local population, and visible demonstrations of the Order's permanent commitment to the defense of Crusader territory. The castle of Tortosa on the Syrian coast, the fortress of Safed in the hills of Galilee, the great citadel at Acre, these and dozens of other fortifications formed a network of military infrastructure that held the Crusader states together even when the political situation was at its most desperate. The Templars were not just soldiers, but fortress builders and garrison commanders, and their engineering knowledge was as important to the defense of the Holy Land as their fighting ability. But the military activities of the Templars were only one part of what had become, by the middle of the 12th century, one of the most complex institutions in the medieval world. The donations of land and money that had poured in from across Europe since the Council of Troyes had given the order an economic base of enormous size. Hundreds of properties across France and England and Iberia and Italy and the German lands and wherever else the crusading movement had taken hold, properties that needed to be managed and made productive if they were to generate the revenue that funded the order's activities in the Holy Land. The management of this European estate led the Templars almost inevitably into the business of finance, and it was in this domain that they made perhaps their most lasting contribution to the development of the Western world. The basic problem of medieval pilgrimage was not just physical danger, but financial vulnerability. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem carried their wealth in the form of gold or silver, which made them a target for robbery every step of the way. The Templars solved this problem with an instrument that was not entirely their invention, but that they developed and systematized to a degree that made them the first genuinely international banking institution in the Western world. The system worked like this. A pilgrim deposited money at a Templar preceptory in France and received in return a document, a letter of credit, that could be exchanged for the equivalent sum minus a fee at any other Templar establishment along the route. The pilgrim traveled without money, with only the document that proved their credit and retrieved their funds when they needed them. This system required the Templars to maintain not just the physical infrastructure of their preceptories, but a network of accounts and records and trusted agents that connected their establishments across thousands of miles. And the skills and the systems developed to manage this network were the foundations of what we would recognize as modern banking. The Templars made loans, accepted deposits, transferred funds across long distances, and developed the accounting techniques necessary to keep track of complex financial transactions involving multiple currencies and multiple time horizons. They became the bankers to kings and popes, managing the finances of the English crown for extended periods, holding deposits from the French royal treasury, and lending money to virtually everyone who needed it, at the rates that the Church's prohibition on usury, lending money at interest, made technically difficult, but practically unavoidable. The income from their financial activities, combined with the income from their European estates, and the donations that continued to flow in from the faithful, made the Templars rich on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. The paradox of the poor Knights of Christ, sitting atop an empire of wealth, was not lost on contemporaries, and it generated criticism and resentment From the order's earliest days, criticism that the Templars sometimes deflected with reference to their military role in the Holy Land, and sometimes simply ignored because their papal privileges made them effectively immune to the complaints of those without the authority to enforce them. The wealth was real, and it was used, at least in part, for the purposes that justified it: the maintenance of the army and the fortresses and the logistical infrastructure that kept the Crusader presence in the Holy Land alive. But it was also used for other things, for the building of magnificent churches and chapter houses in Europe, for the lifestyle of the order's senior officers, which was not always as austere as the rule required, and for the political activities that the order's position in the world inevitably generated. The history of the Templars in the Holy Land is inseparable from the history of the Crusades themselves, and the Crusades were a history of extraordinary military achievement, of desperate defense, of occasional catastrophe, and of the gradual erosion of the Crusader presence in the Levant over the course of nearly 2 centuries. The Templars were present at every significant moment of this history, fighting in almost every major battle, holding almost every major fortress, dying in numbers that repeatedly threatened the order's capacity to replace its losses. The Battle of Montgisard in 1177 was one of the Templars' finest hours, a battle in which a small force of Crusaders, including the Templars, defeated a much larger army led by Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who had been unifying the Muslim states of the region into a single coherent power that threatened to overwhelm the Crusader kingdoms. Saladin's army had been moving toward Jerusalem, and a force of knights led by the leper king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, and including a strong Templar contingent, intercepted and attacked it at Montgisard in an engagement that lasted most of a day and ended with the Muslim army in full retreat. It was one of those battles where everything went right for the attackers and wrong for the defenders, where the charge found the enemy at exactly the right moment and the discipline of the Templar Knights was equal to the demands of the day. But Montgisard was not representative of the general trend of the conflict, which was moving slowly and with occasional reversals against the Crusaders. Saladin was patient, methodical, and brilliant, and he was capable of learning from his defeats in a way that made him progressively more dangerous. He took his time to consolidate his control over the Muslim states that surrounded the Crusader kingdoms, building alliances and managing rivalries, and creating the unified military and political structure that would eventually allow him to concentrate overwhelming force against a divided and chronically under-resourced enemy. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 was the catastrophe that changed everything. The Crusader army, led by a king named Guy of Lusignan, who was persuaded against his better judgment by a faction that included the Templar Grand Master, to march his army across the waterless plateau of the Horns of Hattin in the July heat to relieve a siege, found itself surrounded by Saladin's army and unable to reach water. The knights fought bravely, desperately, in several charges that broke against the encircling Muslim forces, but the army was progressively destroyed, and when the battle was over, the Crusader kingdom had effectively ceased to exist as a military force. Most of the captured knights were executed, and the Templar Grand Master and his captive brothers were beheaded by Muslim scholars who, according to the sources, did so with great enthusiasm and little skill. Jerusalem fell to Saladin 3 months after Hattin, and its fall sent another shockwave through Europe that generated the Third Crusade, the famous campaign led by Richard I of England and Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who drowned in a river before he reached the Holy Land, and whose death removed the largest single contingent from the crusading army. The Third Crusade was a military achievement of considerable distinction, Richard being one of the most formidable battlefield commanders of the medieval period, and it restored the Crusader presence along the coast, capturing Acre after a long siege and winning several important battles. But it did not recapture Jerusalem, and when Richard finally left the Holy Land in 1192, the situation was better than it had been in 1187, but not as good as it had been before Hattin. The Templars rebuilt from the disaster because they had the resources and the organizational capacity to do what no secular military force of the period could have done, to replace catastrophic losses in manpower and equipment and simply continue the mission. They continued to garrison their fortresses, to patrol the roads, to fight the battles that the defense of the Crusader presence required. They fought in the Fourth Crusade, which never reached the Holy Land at all, but ended with the sack of Constantinople and the establishment of a Latin empire in the heart of the Byzantine world. One of the more embarrassing episodes in the whole crusading history. They fought in the 5th and 6th and 7th Crusades, each one a partially successful or wholly unsuccessful attempt to restore the situation in the Holy Land to something that felt like security. The fall of Acre in 1291 was the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, and the Templars fought in the final defense of the city with the same professionalism and determination that had characterized their fighting throughout their history. The last Templar soldiers died in the collapse of a tower rather than surrender it to the Mamluk forces that were destroying the last Crusader stronghold, and their deaths were, in a way that the Order's founders would have recognized and approved of, entirely consistent with the ideal that had animated the institution from the beginning. With the fall of Acre, the military raison d'etre of the Templars, the defense of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had ceased to exist. The Order moved its headquarters to Cyprus and continued to exist, continued to manage its enormous European estates and its financial activities, continued to talk about the possibility of a new crusade that would restore what had been lost. But the sense of purpose that had once given the Order its identity and its discipline was harder to maintain in a comfortable island headquarters than it had been in the desperate circumstances of the Holy Land, and the criticisms that had always circulated about the Order's wealth and its privileges and the gap between its ideals and its practices grew louder in the absence of the military achievements that had once silenced them. By the end of the 13th century, the Knights Templar had accumulated a position of power and influence in the Western world that was, by any measure, extraordinary. They were not the largest landowners in Europe, but they were among the most geographically widespread, with properties in every country where the crusading movement had taken hold. They were not the only bankers in Europe, but they were among the most trusted and most widely connected, with relationships with every major court and every major merchant community, from London to Constantinople, and they had something that no other financial institution of the period possessed: an extensive network of fortified establishments that were genuinely secure, that could hold deposits against the threat of robbery or political confiscation with a reliability that private merchants could not match. The English royal treasury was managed from the London Temple for extended periods. The funds of the crown deposited in the vaults of the order's headquarters in the city, and the order's treasurers acting as advisors and agents to the king's financial officers. Similar arrangements existed in France, where the Templar treasury in Paris was so closely integrated with the royal finances that the line between the order's funds and the crown's funds was sometimes difficult to draw. In Iberia, where the military orders played a crucial role in the Reconquista, the gradual Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, the Templars held territories of considerable strategic importance and exercised a quasi-sovereign authority over the populations within them. This accumulation of wealth and influence was not achieved without cost. The order had from the beginning attracted the envy and resentment of those who felt that its privileges were excessive, that an institution that was exempt from episcopal authority and from tithes and from many of the legal constraints that bound other institutions was an institution that had placed itself above the law in ways that were spiritually and politically dangerous. Popes, who had initially granted those privileges, found themselves dealing with an organization that took the privileges very seriously and was not inclined to allow them to be eroded. Kings who found the Templars useful as bankers sometimes found them less useful as subjects, because the order's direct relationship with the papacy and its exemption from secular jurisdiction meant that it could not always be commanded in the way that the king's other subjects could be commanded. The criticism of the Templars took many forms. There were accusations of financial irregularity, that the order used its position to enrich itself at the expense of those who had donated to it, in the belief that their donations would go to the defense of the Holy Land. There were accusations of military failure, that the Templars had failed to prevent the disasters that had befallen the Crusader kingdoms, that their rivalry with the other military orders, particularly the Knights Hospitaller, had undermined the military effectiveness of the crusading movement. There were accusations of political maneuvering, that the order used its financial power to influence the decisions of popes and kings in ways that served its own interests, rather than the interests of Christendom. And there were, increasingly, accusations of something darker and more difficult to specify, suggestions that the secrecy of the Templar chapter and the strange ritual practices described by disaffected former members pointed to something wrong at the heart of the order, something that could not be entirely named, but could be sensed. The man who would eventually act on these accusations and bring the order to destruction was Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, a title that referred to his physical appearance rather than his character, and that was, in the view of many of his contemporaries, deeply ironic. Philip was a king of remarkable determination and ruthlessness, a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to use whatever tools were available to him to achieve his political and financial goals, including the expulsion of the Jews from France in 1286 and a running conflict with Pope Boniface VIII that had ended with the Pope's death, possibly precipitated by the humiliation he had suffered at Philip's hands. Philip was also perpetually short of money, in the way that medieval kings always were, and the Templars' vast wealth was a constant temptation to a ruler who knew that the order's protections, formidable as they were, depended ultimately on the goodwill of a pope who was, after the death of Boniface, a French archbishop of Bordeaux named Clement V, a man who was significantly less likely to resist Philip's demands than his predecessors had been. On the night of the 12th of October, 1307, sealed orders were delivered to royal officers across France, orders that were not to be opened until the following morning. When dawn broke on the 13th of October, officers across the entire country opened their sealed instructions simultaneously and began carrying them out with the efficiency of an operation that had been planned in detail and kept secret with remarkable effectiveness. By the end of that day, most of the Templars in France had been arrested, the orders preceptories had been seized, and the Inquisition had begun its work. The charges that Philip had prepared against the Templars were extraordinary, combining accusations of actual criminal behavior with accusations of heresy and obscene ritual that were designed to shock and to damage beyond the possibility of defense. The Templars were accused of denying Christ 3 times during their initiation ceremony. They were accused of spitting on the cross. They were accused of worshiping an idol called Baphomet, a mysterious head or figure whose description varied wildly from one accusation to the next. They were accused of obscene kisses and of sexual practices that the documents described with a specificity that was clearly designed to horrify. They were accused of conducting their chapter meetings in secret and of telling new members that their Grand Master had the power to absolve sins, a claim that was theologically impossible for anyone not ordained as a priest. Whether any of these accusations had any basis in reality is a question that historians have argued about for centuries and have never conclusively resolved. The most likely answer is that the core accusations were fabrications or, at most, distortions of actual practices that were entirely innocent, but that could be made to sound sinister. The Templar initiation ceremony, which did involve rituals that were kept secret, may well have included elements that were unusual by the standards of a conventional religious practice, because the order had developed its own distinctive culture over nearly 2 centuries of existence in conditions very different from those of ordinary monastic life. But the extraordinary confessions that the arrested Templars made under torture, confessions that were detailed and specific and that seemed to confirm every charge, were almost certainly the product of the torture rather than of actual guilt. The torture used on the Templars was systematic and brutal, and it was applied with a thoroughness that reflected Philip's determination to obtain the confessions he needed to justify what he had already done. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, confessed under torture and confirmed the charges, and his confession was then read out publicly in Paris to demonstrate the guilt of the organization. When he later attempted to retract his confession, claiming that it had been made under duress and did not reflect the truth, he was ignored. Because the political machinery that had been set in motion did not have a reverse gear, and because the Pope, on whom the order had always depended for protection, was not in a position to provide it. Pope Clement V, the French Pope who resided at Avignon rather than in Rome, was in an impossible position. He was deeply dependent on Philip for his own political survival, and he was being presented with a situation in which the most powerful king in Christendom had already arrested the Templars and obtained their confessions, and was demanding that the Church cooperate in their prosecution. Clement made some attempts to assert his authority over the proceedings, establishing his own papal commission to investigate the charges and arguing with Philip about the proper procedures, but he was never willing or able to directly confront the king and demand the release of the arrested brothers. The papal commission found, after several years of investigation, that the order as a whole was not guilty of the charges brought against it, but this finding was never allowed to override the political reality that Philip had already won. The Council of Vienne in 1312, called by Clement ostensibly to consider the question of the Templars and the possibility of a new crusade, ended with the Pope suppressing the order, not condemning it, a distinction that was important theologically if not practically. The order was dissolved. Its properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, who had been the Templars' great rivals in the Holy Land, and who now became the main beneficiaries of the Templar catastrophe. The brothers themselves were dispersed, some continuing as Hospitallers, some entering other orders, some being released to live out their lives in whatever way was available to them. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, had spent the years since his arrest in prison alternately confessing and retracting, refusing to maintain the confession that would have saved his life, and insisting on the innocence of himself and his order. In March of 1314, he was brought before a commission in Paris to hear his final sentence, which was expected to be life imprisonment. Instead, de Molay, old and broken by years of imprisonment, chose one final act of defiance. He publicly retracted his confession, declared that the order was innocent of all the charges against it, and condemned as false the proceedings that had led to its destruction. This public retraction was unexpected and politically catastrophic because it meant that the confession on which the entire prosecution rested had been repudiated by the man who had made it. Philip's response was immediate and predictable. That same evening, de Molay and another Templar, who had also recanted, were burned at the stake on an island in the Seine in Paris, and the smoke from the fire rose into the evening sky over the most powerful city in France. And the story of the Knights Templar reached its last recorded chapter. There is a legend, irresistible as legends always are, that as he burned, de Molay called from the flames on Clement and Philip to join him before God's judgment seat within the year, and that both of them died within months of his execution. Whether or not de Molay actually said this, and it is the kind of dramatic deathbed pronouncement that gets attached to famous martyrs, regardless of whether it actually occurred. Both Clement and Philip did in fact die within the year, Clement in April of 1314, and Philip in November of the same year, which was the kind of coincidence that made perfectly rational medieval people see the hand of God and the curse of a wronged man in the ordinary operation of mortality. The suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century did not end the Templar story. It began another story, or rather, it began several other stories that have been running in parallel ever since. Stories about what the Templars really were, and what they really believed, and what became of their treasure and their secrets. Stories that have fueled an extraordinary amount of speculation and investigation, and sometimes outright fabrication, over the course of the 7 centuries that have passed since de Molay burned on his island in the Seine. The question of the Templar treasure is the most practically focused of these mysteries. When the officers of Philip IV arrived at the Templar treasury in Paris on the morning of the 13th of October, they found considerably less than they had expected. The treasury of the order, which everyone knew to be enormous, had been largely removed before the arrests, apparently in the days immediately preceding them, which suggests that someone in the order had been warned or had guessed what was coming. Where the treasure went has never been definitively established, and the various theories that have been proposed over the centuries, that it was shipped to England, that it was hidden in Scotland, that it was buried in the Pyrenees, that it made its way to the New World centuries before Columbus, are all plausible enough to fuel speculation, and none of them is supported by compelling evidence. The Templar connection to Freemasonry is another strand of the legend that has been endlessly elaborated and debated. The claim that the modern Masonic movement descended from the Knights Templar, either directly through an unbroken organizational lineage or indirectly through the transmission of Templar ideas and rituals, is made with great confidence by many Freemasons and rejected with equal confidence by most historians. The evidence for a direct organizational connection is thin to non-existent. The Masonic degrees that claim Templar descent appearing in the 18th century without clear links to any earlier Templar tradition. But the connection is not entirely invented either, because the Templars were certainly one of the historical models that the founders of speculative Freemasonry drew on when they were constructing the mythology of their new institution. The Holy Grail, that mysterious object that appears in medieval romance as the cup of the Last Supper, the vessel that caught the blood of Christ, the object whose quest occupied the knights of King Arthur's court, has been connected to the Templars in various ways by various theorists over the centuries. Some versions of the Grail legend were written during the period of Templar activity, and some of their authors were connected in various ways with the milieu of the military orders. And it is possible that the Grail stories drew on elements of the Templar mystique. Even if the specific objects and locations described in the romances were fictional, the idea that the Templars possessed or guarded some kind of sacred object, whether it was the Grail itself, or the Ark of the Covenant, or the head of John the Baptist, or some other relic of immense power, is one that appears repeatedly in the mythology of the Order, and that the Order's attachment to the Temple Mount, where the Ark had once been housed, gives a superficial plausibility. The mysterious idol called Baphomet, the figure or head that the Templars were accused of worshipping, has generated as much speculation as anything else in the Templar story. The name itself may be a corruption of Mahomet, the medieval European rendering of Muhammad, suggesting a charge of secret Islamic sympathies, or it may be a Latin acronym for something else entirely, or it may be meaningless. The descriptions of the idol varied so widely in the trial testimony that it is impossible to reconstruct what, if anything, it actually was. Most historians believe it was an invention of the prosecution, or at most, a distortion of some innocent object in the Templars' possession. But the image of the goat-headed figure, called Baphomet, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Western occultism, appearing in the work of 19th century esotericists, and from there into the popular culture of the 20th and 21st centuries. What can be said with confidence about the Templars is simpler and in some ways more interesting than the layers of legend that have accumulated around them. They were a genuine innovation, the first successful attempt to combine the spiritual authority of monasticism with the martial values of medieval knighthood, and the institution they created was a model that, influenced every subsequent military order, from the Hospitallers to the Teutonic Knights to the dozens of smaller orders that appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries. The financial techniques they developed, the letter of credit, the centralized account management, the secure deposit facility, were genuine contributions to the development of the Western financial system, precursors of the banking institutions that would transform the economies of the late medieval and early modern world. The Templar castles and churches that still stand across Europe and the former territories of the Crusader states are physical monuments to an organization of extraordinary energy and ambition, to the thousands of men who gave their lives to an ideal that was sincere even when the institution that embodied it was imperfect. The round churches that the Templars built in imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the church in London, and the church in Cambridge, and the others scattered across Europe, are reminders that behind the financial empire and the political maneuvering and the eventual catastrophe, there was a genuine spiritual impulse. Men who were trying, however imperfectly, to live up to the demanding ideal that Bernard of Clairvaux had articulated in his treatise on the new knighthood. The trial and the execution of the Templars was, in the judgment of most historians, a profound injustice, a politically motivated prosecution of an institution that had its faults but was not guilty of the crimes for which it was condemned. Philip IV got most of what he wanted: the destruction of an organization that had become a rival power within his kingdom, and the seizure of its assets, though he got considerably less of the latter than he had hoped because of the disappearance of the treasury. Clement V got the credit for cooperating with the king and avoiding a confrontation that might have been even more damaging to the papacy than the one he had managed to avoid, and the Templars got death or dispersal, and the particular form of immortality that comes to those who are destroyed unjustly and remembered for it. The story did not end in 1314. It continued in the manuscripts that preserved the trial records and the papal documents and the accounts of chroniclers in the properties that had once belonged to the order and that were redistributed across Europe in ways that left traces in the records, in the memories of the communities that had known the order and that preserved their own versions of what had happened, and it continued in the imagination of the people who encountered the story in later centuries and found in it something that spoke to their own concerns, their own anxieties about power and secrecy and the relationship between spiritual authority and political force. The Knight in the White Mantle with the Red Cross is one of the most powerful images that the medieval world produced, an image that combines beauty and violence, devotion and danger, in a way that continues to resonate 7 centuries after the last of those mantles was folded away. Whatever the Templars actually were, whatever they actually believed, whatever they actually did in their secret chapters and their midnight prayers, they have become something larger than themselves in the imagination of the world that came after them, a symbol of a particular kind of dedication, a particular kind of sacrifice, a particular kind of mystery that refuses to be fully illuminated, no matter how many documents are discovered and how many historians apply themselves to the task. Let the white mantles rest now in the darkness of 7 centuries. Let the fortresses they built fall silent, their stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain and the footsteps of tourists who come to stand in the spaces where the Templars once prayed and planned and prepared for battle, let Jacques de Molay rest where he was buried after the fire on the island in the Seine, wherever that place actually was, in the ground of a France that has spent 7 centuries not quite knowing what to make of the crime committed in its name against the order that protected its pilgrims and managed its treasury and died on its borders. The mystery remains. The treasure has not been found. The truth of what happened in those secret chapter meetings is still not entirely known, and the knights in their white mantles, the poor soldiers of Christ, who were also the richest institution in Christendom, who were both monks and warriors, and bankers and builders and diplomats, remain one of the most extraordinary and most enduring creations of the medieval imagination, an institution so paradoxical and so complicated and so finally tragic that the world has never quite been able to leave it alone. The night holds many things, among them this, and so we leave the Knights Templar, resting in the long silence that has followed their destruction. We walked through the world that made them, that complicated medieval world of faith and violence, and the peculiar logic of the Crusades that turned killing into a spiritual act. We stood at the founding of the order on the Temple Mount of Jerusalem with Hugues de Payens and his small band of brothers in their borrowed quarters, and we watched as Bernard of Clairvaux turned that modest beginning into one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. We followed the Templars through their centuries of service in the Holy Land, through the great victories and the catastrophic defeats, through Montgisard and Hatton, and the long, slow decline that ended with the fall of Acre. We sat with the bankers and the builders and the administrators who made the order's European empire function, and we tried to understand how the same institution could be simultaneously a religious house and a military force and a financial empire and still maintain any coherent identity across nearly 2 centuries of existence. We watched Philip IV of France bring the whole structure down in a single coordinated dawn raid, and we sat with Jacques de Molay in his prison cell through the years of his captivity and his recantation and his final defiant act in the firelight on the island in the Seine. And we explored the legends, the treasure and the grail, and the mysterious Baphomet, and all the other elements of the myth that has grown up around the order in the 7 centuries since its dissolution, and we tried to see, through the layers of speculation and fabrication, the real organization underneath, the real men who took real vows and fought real battles and made real sacrifices for a cause they genuinely believed in. These are human stories. The Templars were human, their faith was genuine, and their faults were real, and their end was unjust, and their legacy is still with us in the round churches and the old preceptories and the financial techniques and the enduring fascination of a mystery that will probably never be entirely resolved. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue and let the medieval world keep talking in its old slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The white mantles are folded, the castles are quiet, the long trial is over. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, let your hands open slowly. The way hands open when everything has been said and nothing more needs to be done. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like the candles burning low in a chapter house at the end of a long night of prayer. Sleep well, and good night.